Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. Welcome to a Federalist Society debate on California pension reform. I'd just like to thank the California Western Student Chapter for hosting us here today. I'd also like to recognize Judge Joe Brannigan of the Superior Court. Thank you for joining us here today. So it should be a really great event right here between two of our biggest local experts on pension reform. And I suspect they won't have very much in common, but I think it'll be a very informative and outstanding debate right here. So let me go ahead and introduce our moderator, Bob Gaglione. He's the principal attorney at the Gaglione Law Group. His practice includes business and civil litigation. He's an arbitrator for the American Arbitration Association and a visiting professor at DeVry University and Keller Graduate School of Management. He is a board member, past president, and founder of the San Diego chapter of the Federalist Society, as well as the chairman of our board of advisors. Please welcome Bob Gaglione.
And it's a privilege to be here today. This is going to be, I'm sure, a very fascinating coverage of a very important topic. Our two speakers have joined us at the Federalist Society in the past to debate this very subject. About 5 years ago, I think we were talking before the program, we had a pension reform debate over at the old County Bar Center, in which our two guest speakers, DeMaio and Mike Zuchet, were, I think you may have both been on the council at that time still, or just shortly?
I was on the council, Mike. I don't know where you were with them MEA at that point.
Yeah, okay. Well, we had at the time also City Attorney Jan Goldsmith moderate the debate. So as many of you, I'm sure these gentlemen need no introduction, but I'll give them a brief introduction. DeMaio is a local radio talk show host, and as I mentioned, a former San Diego City Council member, and he's also one of the authors of the Proposition B, which I'm sure we'll talk about today, to reform the City of San Diego's pension system. And Michael Zuchet is the general manager of the San Diego Municipal Employees Association, also a former City Council member in the City of San Diego, and formerly the deputy mayor of the City of San Diego. So what we're going to do today, the format is going to be fairly simple in that we're going to talk first about the past. Where did public pensions arise? How did they get started? When did they become an issue that we even discussed in the public policy arena? And then secondly, we'll segue from that into the current state of public pensions in the state of California, and I'm sure we'll talk specifically as well about the City of San Diego. And then really we'll get to what I think is the most important topic of the day, of the future of public pensions here and elsewhere. And these two gentlemen are probably the two top speakers in our city, if not in the state, on this topic. So we're very, very honored that they're able to join us today. And I would ask if you would, please hold your questions till the end of the program, since we want to cover a lot of material. We're going to probably leave time for questions. And as I understand it, we have the room till 1:15. So that's our goal, is to complete the program. So we'll try and wrap up around 1 or 1:05 to enable 10 or 15 minutes for questions if we stay on track. So without further ado, let me introduce and invite Carl DeMaio to tell us a little bit about the history of public pensions. Carl?
Well, great. Thanks for all coming here. And this really is a significant distance from 5 years ago. I remember at that point we were still working on drafting our pension reform initiative for San Diego, Proposition B. And we had a full room of lawyers. I don't know how many lawyers we have today. But the challenge then was, how do you legally reform vested pension benefits? It's very difficult. And at that time, we were chatting with our colleagues up in San Jose, Mayor Chuck Reed and some of his colleagues on the city council, and we were comparing notes as to what's the best way, what's a legal way to actually get reform in government pensions. They took a different approach than we did. Their initiative did not survive the legal challenges. Our initiative has survived all 3 legal challenges that have been thrown at it thus far in 3 different courtrooms with 3 different judges. There's still an issue pending, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But at the time I said, yes, you could reform vested pension benefits legally. And we were able, in our ballot measure, I believe, to come up with the solution to how you can tackle vested pension benefits and produce savings, significant savings for taxpayers. We are seeing in pension reform debates or discussions tides of reform. In 2012, it was a really serious problem. It still is a very serious problem, but not as noticeable because we've had really healthy revenues flowing into cities and counties and state coffers. I believe that 2017, 2018, we're going to go back to the high tide of reform as investment losses catch up, as the economy cools a bit, as some of the revenue sources retrench. You definitely are going to see an appetite for reform in that cycle. The current system is unsustainable. We have people who are not paying a fair share into the system, although some would argue, well, we fixed that. Well, if you go back, we haven't recouped all of the missed payments that were not made into the pension system, both on the part of the employees as well as on the part of the taxpayers. A lot of the politicians said, oh, we'll take payment holidays, we won't put in what is responsible. And so the question is, who should share the cost here? What's a fair and equitable distribution of costs? Number two, how do we prevent cooking of the books? Under the defined pension systems, the boards, along with a lot of the government accountants, are cooking the books using rosy scenarios because, hey, it'll catch up with us years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And so there's a risk in defined benefit pensions that the books will be cooked, and then we've created a very big financial problem. Government pensions are not governed under ERISA. In other words, no one goes to jail when they cook the books, unless they're issuing securities and bonds. That's where the city of San Diego got in trouble, was in its issuance of bonds, not in cooking the books as it relates to the pension liability. And so we don't have the same sort of oversight and regulation of government pension programs that we do in the private sector pension programs. And so there's a risk, a significant risk of cooked books. And third, fairness in terms of payout. We see government employees able to retire after just 30 years with higher pension payouts than the highest salary they earned working for taxpayers. You can't get that in the private sector. It's just not available. And so the question becomes, is that a fair benefit to provide government employees? Some will argue that, well, you know, government employment doesn't provide as good a salary, so we got to make it up on the benefit side. Well, the data doesn't show that to be true. In fact, the data shows that in government, for most classifications, positions, they're earning more in salary before you even look at the benefits. On top of that, in the private sector, you've got the feast and famine of the up and down of the market. You could actually lose your job in the private sector if your company's not doing very well. In government, we don't print pink slips unless it's as part of a political campaign to scare people. Oh, we're going to lay off the firefighters. Oh, we're going to lay off the teachers. And so you have a better, a more secure environment in government for your job. You're not as, it's not as sensitive to the market's ups and downs. And there's value in having job security in a government position. This all gets to, do you need to have more lavish benefits for government employees? The ultimate measure is, can you recruit and can you retain? And the answer is, in government, yes, we've been able to recruit and retain. And the challenges we have with recruitment and retention stem not from the compensation package, but from other factors in terms of how management treats its employees, the sense of value employees may have, and of course the hiring process and how long it takes to hire a government employee versus the time to hire in the private sector. And so I want to make sure that as we look at pensions, that we look at it from that standpoint of the ultimate goal that we have is to recruit and retain quality employees to provide quality services. And I think we should judge any sort of pension program, any benefit package, up against that standard. If you pay too much for your pension benefits, if you're giving too lavish a benefit, we no longer can afford it. And when that means that we have to cut back on the number of government employees, that means that we got to raise the taxes and cut the services on the taxpayers. And I don't think that those trade-offs are appropriate. I think we do have to be constantly going back to, are we offering a competitive benefit package, salary and benefits, to recruit, retain quality employees? Right now, the pension programs are unsustainable and they overcompensate on that question. That's why we're going to need to continue to reform these benefits going forward.
stand if that's okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for hosting and for moderating, Bob. I appreciate it. Nice to be with you. And Carl. Carl is someone I respect a lot and enjoy working with, and nice to see you again. Even though 25% of what comes out of his mouth is horribly misleading, but that's better than the other 75%, which is just false. But anyway, nice to see you. So I think it would be fun to get into the legalities of Prop B, as Carl and Bob sort of mentioned, but just taking a step back and picking up on some of the themes that Mr. DeMaio just talked about. The roots of the problem, at least in the city of San Diego, actually go back to 1980 and 1981 and 1982 when Pete Wilson was mayor, and the city was strapped for cash, and the city has a very low tax structure. We don't charge as much as other cities in California do for all kinds of stuff: hotel taxes, sales taxes, business license taxes, franchise fees, you name it. The taxes that municipalities in California rely on are very low in San Diego, and that's good. Nothing wrong with that. The problem is when the politicians, as Mr. DeMaio likes to say, want to do other things, as Mayor Wilson did back then, and they think, gee, should we pay these employee obligations that we promised as part of their compensation package, or should we defer that and spend it on things like ballparks and stadiums and convention centers and political conventions and everything else? What should we do? And so actually Mayor Wilson started with promising, for instance, city employees paid retiree health care for life. So he said, we will take care of your health care for life, and the city will pay for it. And all you have to do in exchange is vote yourself out of the Social Security system. And that's what city employees did. And what did the politicians do? They promised that benefit for all of the 1980s, all of the 1990s, much of the 2000s, and they never funded it. And around, when it all hit the fan in the Great Recession and the mid-2000s, they said, gee, we've got $1 billion liability here. What do we do now? And the employees said, well, you can't pull the rug out from under us now. You promised this to us 25 years ago. We voted ourselves out of Social Security. What are you going to do? And Mr. DeMaio and Mayor Sanders and everybody else said, well, we're just going to take it away. Sorry, we didn't fund it. And that's essentially what they did. Go back to the early 80s. It was Mayor Wilson who started with the concept of when the pension fund has a good year, a good investment year, let's take the so-called excess earnings and spend it on stuff. Let's give more to employees that way, or spend it on other things. Well, there's no such thing as excess earnings in a pension fund, because as the stock market goes up and down, you need to have the good times and the bad times. As Carl just said, bad times come. And so there was a lot of practices that were fully ingrained in the political structure in San Diego long before labor unions or weenie liberal politicians like me came along. It was ingrained in the Republican establishment of San Diego that we can't raise taxes. We need to keep telling the citizens of San Diego that we can do it all. You don't need to raise your taxes. You don't need to pay what those idiots in Los Angeles and San Francisco are paying. You can pay less and get more. We can do it all. We can do it all. And how did they do it all? They shortchanged their long-term obligations, which in a city that employs 10,000 people is primarily obligations for post-employment benefits to employees. So that's how we got in the situation we got to. And the response was essentially not to fix it, not to fund it, but to take away. And so beginning in the mid-2000s, they took away lots of programs like the DROP program, which has an infamous history, but is not the monster it seems to be. The retiree health program went away for new employees. Purchase of service credit, this notion of a 13th check, that was that Pete Wilson thing for extra retirement benefits. A supplemental savings plan, which they gave to employees in addition to their defined benefit pension. All of that went away. Meanwhile, the pay, the actual compensation for city employees, remains below market. Their benefits used to be competitive. Now their benefits are not competitive anymore. And then along comes Mr. DeMaio and Mayor Sanders, who hatched the idea of being further leaders in pension reform. We're going to lead the world in pension reform. We're going to take away defined benefit pensions altogether. everybody should have a 401k because that's what they get in the private sector, that's what our employees are going to get, and everybody's going to follow. There's a number of problems with that, but the first problem is that those proclamations were made in 2010. It is now 2016. Nobody followed. Not one city, not one county, not one jurisdiction in the state of California or anywhere in the United States followed. The other problem is, back when all that was happening in 2010 and unemployment was double digits and people were just lucky to have a job, well now it's 2016. Unemployment in San Diego County is 4.5%. The job market is very tight. The city, as Mr. DeMaio said, is swimming in revenue. They want to expand. They want to hire more people to do infrastructure and fill potholes and be police officers. And so they're in a competitive job environment, yet they're offering no defined benefit pension, and they're the only ones in the state of California doing that, which is the definition of a competitive disadvantage. And they're offering lower salaries. And so let me end by agreeing with Mr. DeMaio. It all comes down to recruitment and retention. And there, I don't know where he's been the last couple of years, but the city is in a crisis with respect to recruitment and retention. And look no further than sworn police officers. We can't hire them. We can't keep them. Officer safety is in jeopardy. Response times are down. More recently, it's been clear that our 911 dispatchers can't be hired. They've been on mandatory overtime for 4 years now. Not because of some bureaucratic problem in the personnel department, because nobody wants to work for the city of San Diego. Why would you? You can go to Chula Vista or Carlsbad or the county of San Diego or the sheriff's department and make 20, 30% more and get a defined benefit pension. And so it's nice to stand up and say we're the leaders and we pay lower taxes and we pay less to our employees and we don't like defined benefit pensions, so we're not going to pay it to them. But the operational consequences of that are very real. And it's not just in the public safety arena, it's in the infrastructure arena. The city last year added 500 new positions to its budget, largely in infrastructure. Engineers, surveyors, contract administrators, all kinds of positions that need to be done to do infrastructure. They can't hire them. We're 10 and a half months into the fiscal year. They still haven't hired the employees that they funded back on July 1st. They're barely keeping up with attrition for the employees that they had last July 1st. And so this is the definition of a recruitment and retention problem, and it's directly attributable to Proposition B in particular, the elimination of the defined benefit pension when, despite the promises of the proponents, nobody followed. And there's no prospect of anybody following. I'm sure Mr. DeMaio will debate that point, but it ain't happening anywhere else. And now the politicians of the day are trying to figure out how to run the city when they can't hire employees, and they're finding it pretty difficult to do.
Thank you. Well, that's a very good background, and we certainly have set the stage to talk about where we are today and where we're going in the future. And I'm going to segue to the next topic and ask Mr. Zucchet again to come up, and he'll start this topic off, and that is, what is the status of public pensions today? And I'd like each of our speakers maybe to address specifically their constituents. Mr. Zucchet works at a union of public employees. Mr. DeMaio is, I'll call you a taxpayer watchdog if I may, but more importantly, he's a talk radio host. And I'm sure your callers are calling in when you have this topic on the air and you're getting good feedback from the public about where we are today. So let me start with that.
Sure, and let me start where I left off with a good friend of Mr. DeMaio's and a leader in pension reform in the city of San Diego, and in fact she is one of the named proponents of Proposition B, the Pension Reform Initiative of 2012. She was also chair of the city's Pension Reform Committee when I was on the city council. I voted against her appointment, but anyway, she was the chair, and in her report in 2004, she wrote, "The Pension Reform Committee concludes that the city should stay with a defined benefit pension plan. There is nothing inherently wrong with the defined benefit pension plan, and eliminating the defined benefit plan in favor of a defined contribution plan would not necessarily result in an improved situation. The committee believes, based on credible evidence, that the city would in fact experience recruitment and retention difficulties in offering only a defined contribution plan in lieu of a defined benefit plan to its newly hired employees." And so it was clear back then that this situation was foreseeable. And because of that, unions in San Diego worked with politicians at the bargaining table, which is where you're supposed to work these things out, and we were a part of eliminating and reforming all of those things I talked about earlier, including substantially reducing the defined benefit pension formula itself. In 2009, we essentially, effectively, raised the retirement age to get the full pension from what was 55 years old to 65 years old. That's a dramatic difference in the cost of that system. We worked together to reform the retiree health care system. We eliminated those other benefits. And so we get to, then the Great Recession hits. Elected officials are looking for scapegoats and looking for votes, and they want to go further. And they do what they did with Proposition B, and that's why we're in the situation we're in. Now, what was the question?
What do your constituents say about pension reform?
So my constituents aren't a big fan of pension reform because the operations, well, for obvious reasons, for selfish reasons, they're not compensated very well. But for other reasons, it's because their jobs are a lot harder to do. The public doesn't like them very much anymore because the proponents of Prop B told everybody that every city employee makes $150,000 while working and $300,000 in retirement, and every librarian makes a couple $100,000 a year, and other complete misstatements. And just to be clear what the record is, the average employee I represent, and I represent about half of the city, librarians, park and rec workers, 911 dispatchers, engineers, sort of the white-collar workforce of the city, their average salary, annual salary, is $54,000 a year. They get no Social Security, and if they work the 30 years or 25 years that Mr. DeMaio talked about, and if they pay every 2 weeks out of their paycheck to pay for their own pension, when they retire, they earn on average $32,000 a year in retirement. That's the average person that MEA, Municipal Employees Association, represents. It's not hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's not more in retirement than it is when you're working, and it's no Social Security. And so we can debate whether that's too much or too little, but those are the facts in terms of the averages. Obviously, Mr. DeMaio and others are going to focus on the top 10 people, or a fire battalion chief, or the library director for 40 years. That's different. I don't represent any of those people. They're management people. When Mr. DeMaio was on the council, if he didn't like their salaries, he could have cut them back then. But the rank and file of the city, that's the reality. And so their view of the whole demonization of public employees and public employee pensions over the last 10 years has been very negative. And it contributes, as Mr. DeMaio said, to the notion of morale, of feeling that you're a valued employee. How valued does an employee feel when the mayor of the city and the city attorney of the city you work for spends all day trying to figure out how to go back on promises that were made to the employee years or decades ago? And so it's been a very rough time to be a San Diego City employee. And at the same time, they've been at the bargaining table working with the city to make reforms when they were justified by the financials, not by the politics, but where the financials were needed. And the retiree health example is a perfect example. A lot of our employees that we represent were upset that we went to the bargaining table and renegotiated the retiree health deal. And they said, Pete Wilson promised it to me in 1982. What are we going to do? Why are you going back on it? Because the reality is nobody funded it. And it's $1 billion liability. The city doesn't have $1 billion lying around. And if we don't work with them, they're going to take us to court and sue us. And, you know, we can roll the dice or we can work with them. And we decided to work with them and come out with good solutions that most of the city council voted for. And Republican mayors went along with. And so in that environment, to be so demonized for so long, and then to continue to hear by people who want to sort of push this as a political issue going forward, that still, you know, you don't have a recruitment or retention problem, you should be happy you have a job, that's just not going to cut it. And they're showing how they feel about that with their feet. They're going to the county, they're going to Chula Vista, they're going to Carlsbad, and those other cities where we normally, you know, San Diego used to be the big city where you get the transfers, the lateral transfers. Nobody wants to come for the city of San Diego because they're all in defined benefit pension programs somewhere else. Why would they give up all those years of service to come to the city of San Diego? So this is a true crisis. Doesn't feel like a crisis, except for perhaps if you've called 911 lately and waited on hold for 5 minutes. But you'll feel it more and more operationally as the city simply can't hire the people to do the job that the citizens demand and that the money is there for. It's not a money problem. It's a competitive compensation problem.
All right. Well, Mike and I have a different role. We also have different perspectives, but I think you have to start with the role. Mike's job as the union boss is to fight for his members. If he doesn't fight for his members, he's not going to be in a job very much longer. It comes as no surprise to me that the head of a union is going to come in saying we're not being paid enough. You give them everything they want, the very next day they're going to walk in saying we're still not being paid enough. And so that's his job, and he does it really well. And perhaps part of the problem is that the union heads in the city did their jobs way too well for too long, and the politicians were not willing to do their job. I have a different constituency. My constituency focuses on the taxpayer, but it also includes city employees. Let me explain why. The taxpayer doesn't want to pay a lot, but they want to get a lot, right? They want to pay the least amount of taxes, but they also love to get the services. Quality roads, 911 response times, after-school programs. And so the challenge is, how do we make effective public policy? How do we get the most efficient government to try to maximize the amount of services we're receiving? And in order to get good services, we have to keep an eye on how do we recruit and retain our employees. It's a bit more complicated than Mike's job, which is, hey, I'm only focusing on the employees. And I get that. He's a good advocate. So when you look at this, I've always said you cannot make a decision that puts you at a disadvantage for recruiting and retaining your employees, because guess what? That may save money for taxpayers, but it also does not achieve what they want, which are the quality services. We have a balancing act. We talk about averages. Let's talk about averages. And Mike likes to say that, well, you know, we were promised this, and really we're not really earning a whole lot. Sure, I always use the example of the top paid pension person in the city of San Diego. Last year, the top payout for a pension was $785,000 and some change. $679 for a police captain. Not the police chief, a police captain.
On a one-time basis.
Well, a lump sum payment plus an ongoing six-figure, $180,000 a year. That's just one. Okay, well, what's going on, Carl? That's police. Well, let's talk about the librarian. She's getting $238,000 a year for life. That's not a lump sum. That's for life. You all in law school, you're in the wrong place. Go find out about the Dewey Decimal System. You will make bank in the city of San Diego. 238, some change. Plus free health care for life and an unknown amount of 401k. Because as Mike was saying, they got free health care for life, and they got a pension, and they got a 401k. Pretty cool. Pretty generous. Now let's talk about the other averages. You don't like me cherry picking, so let me take the top 100. The top 100 pensioners in the city of San Diego last year. You know what their average pension check was? $324,242. Pretty decent. Pretty extraordinary. You show me a company out there that's paying out that level of pension to their top 100. Retirees. How about we take the top 1,000? That's a big number. 1,000 city retirees, city employees. What was their average last year? $133,629. Average, 1,000 people. Now mind you, we only have 9,000 employees in the city of San Diego. Pretty generous. You show me an organization, a company out there that pays 1,000 of its retirees, $133,624. Mike likes to say my average member averages $50,000 and some change, $55,000. Do you know that he's taking the person who retired in 1981 into that account? It's really interesting what you do when you take on people who retired way, way back. And by the way, people who work fractional jobs. So if you've worked 10 years in the city of San Diego, but you went on to another government agency and now draw a big pension from there, maybe the county or the state of California or the feds, he's taking your 10 years of service and applying it to his averages. We actually got around the fuzzy math when we asked the actuaries in the city of San Diego, when we put together Prop B, give me the average of if you are a Mike Zucchett employee, blue collar, white collar employee, and you work for 30 years in the city of San Diego, what is your average? 129% of your highest salary for life on day one, plus guaranteed COLAs, plus free healthcare for life. Michael wanted you to know that the city left Social Security and offered free healthcare for life as a result. That's not actually true. The city of San Diego left Medicare and said we will take care of your healthcare for life if we leave Medicare. That happened in the 1980s. 18 months later, the US Congress decided, oops, we made a mistake, all municipal employees are to go back in Medicare. So we went back into Medicare. But we never turned around and said, okay, that free healthcare for life that would replace Medicare, we're taking that away. So city employees, the reason why we reformed retiree healthcare is that not only were they Medicare eligible, but they also were getting, get this, $8,800 plus per year for extra health insurance above and beyond Medicare. Again, we do have a problem with the fact that the city skipped pension payments. We have a bigger problem with the fact that the city allowed employees to skip their contributions for their pensions. Payment holidays. You don't have to pay for it. No contribution needed. But the biggest problem we have is that the benefit package itself is out of whack. It is completely much more generous than you find in the private sector. So what did we do with Prop B? We said, number one, we want our politicians to pay their bills when they're due. No more of the bait and switch. No more doing what Mike Zuchet alleges. You have to pay your employees the year in which they render the service, like any other company out there. Defined contribution systems are the only system that you can force that integrity and accountability. Another thing about the defined contribution system with Prop B, we decided not to sit there and guess what the right benefit should be. We went to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics and we said, give us the average contribution of private and nonprofit employers in San Diego County towards retirement benefit, not including retiree medical, just retirement payments. 9.2% of payroll was what the number came back with, 9.2%. Do you know what we mandate in Prop B? 9.2% of every employee's payroll shall be provided in a defined contribution from the city taxpayers. To the penny, we benchmark against the private sector. So for Mike to say, well, it's Prop B that's causing us to be at a disadvantage. No, baloney. Take a look at the BLS statistics. We are absolutely to the penny competitive with the private sector. And that's before you take a look at the generous health care and other packages we have, including employee leave. I mean, I could go on and on about uniform bonuses, fit bonuses. It is a smorgasbord of little give-me's and goodies that we give out. But we decided to try to be as fact-based as possible in benchmarking against the average. Now, you can argue that the private sector sucks, that they don't provide their employees with a retirement security. And we can have that discussion, absolutely. But as it relates to recruitment, retention, we wanted to be competitive, and that's what Prop B set up. That's for the new system. And by the way, we offered our employees the ability to go back in Social Security. We said 9.2% includes 6.2% for Social Security and then 3% for a 401k or a private annuity, privately placed annuity. And after Prop B passed, we sat down with the unions and we negotiated. The unions decided they did not want to go back into Social Security. Now this is after in the campaign they said they wanted Social Security. And I said, hold on folks, we're going to meet and confer on that in good faith. We don't want to bind ourselves to that. You may decide on your own that going back into Social Security and trusting the politicians in Washington with your money, probably not such a good idea. But hey, at the end of the day, if you want to do that, we'll write the check. Either we'll give it to you or we'll give it to the Fed politicians. We're going to pay the same amount one way or another. They changed their position between June 2nd and mid-July. They even threw their fellow Democrats under the bus up in Sacramento. They went up to Sacramento and said, force the city of San Diego to give us Social Security. You pass a law, Ben Way, so forcing us into Social Security. They lobbied. They got the bill. The bill was later on overturned. But they got the bill. But then when they sat down with the number crunchers, they realized, oh, wait a minute, we don't want Social Security. we get hosed in Social Security. We want that money. We want that extra 6.2% in private accounts. And so we said, hey, your decision, let's do it. We'll sign on the dotted line. Why? Because we want to be an employer of choice. That's what Prop B is all about, is providing safety and safeguards for taxpayers and limiting our risk, but providing flexibility so that we can, in good negotiations, work a better package with our employees. The other thing we did was we wanted to stop the hemorrhaging from existing employees. Prop B, the innovative part of Prop B is not, hey, we benchmark against the private sector for new hires. That's pretty easy. The innovative part was, what do you do about the existing liability for current workers? You can't take pensions away. And I was very clear that I did not want to violate agreements, vested rights that we already have. What we did there is we said, we're going to honor your agreement. We got a contract with you. We're going to honor it. But part of that contract allows us certain rights and certain reforms. For example, your pension is a formula. Your vested right under the contract is a formula. Not an amount, a formula. The formula is years of service times a multiplier times your highest salary. Years of service, we can't do anything about that. You served 30 years. We could fire you, but the liability is still going to be the same from an actuarial standpoint. Multiplier in a contract, that's just stipulated. It's a number. Can't change that. If I change that number, well, that's tripping the vested law. I'm changing the contract. Highest salary. That's where the door opens. And there is where we found that you could reform vested pension benefits legally and in a very powerful way to save money and reform some of these extraordinary payouts. And that's where we basically said we're going to do a pensionable pay freeze. Whatever you've earned under the contract today, we're going to honor. We're not going to go below because we can't. We're going to freeze it. But we won't allow that to increase for 5 years. Now we could extend that for another 5 years, another 10 years, but until everyone's out, in which case that's what we're going to talk about for the future. But for 5 years, we're going to freeze it and see what happens to our debt, see what happens to our liability. And guess what happens? We get a 5–6%, depending upon the classification, gain. We earn 5 and 6% because our liability is not growing by 5 or 6% with salary inflation. It's frozen at that certain level. And so when you take a look at what we did, we stayed within the law, we met our contracts and our obligations, and we have an eye towards how do we have a retirement benefit that is indeed competitive with the private sector. Now, I understand that the employees don't like that because, hey, if you can get $785,679, by golly, you're going to want to get that. I understand it. But that does not mean that I have to say yes and give in, because that would be violating our obligation to the taxpayer. But frankly, it would be violating our obligation to the employee, because we will go bankrupt if we have more of these sorts of pensions. Someone has to be the adult and say no, and that's part of what was driving Prop B.
Thank you both very much. So we're going to now focus in the next 10 minutes on the topic of the future of pension reform, and both of our speakers are again very involved in that and how these issues will be resolved in the years ahead. First I'll go to Mr. DeMaio and then Mr. Zucchet, and then we'll take questions when they're done.
Try to be very brief on that so we can have time for questions. There are two tracks that we're working on pension reform. One is continuing to implement Prop B in San Diego as the supermajority of voters in San Diego have now dictated. It passed with 68% of the vote. It is saving us money. Our pension payment was supposed to approach $500 million a year. We've been able to keep the payment in the mid 200 millions. It's still too much money, granted, but we are saving that money. We also are seeing significant savings by not giving into the union demands for employee pickups. That was going to be the first thing they asked for when we had the economic recovery. Prop B says no. You have to pay a fair share contribution for your pension benefits. And so we want to make sure that we keep these savings. We want to make sure that this benefit package becomes the norm for new hires in the city of San Diego. How do we do that? Well, the unions are suing. They're not suing on the basis of what we're doing. The pension pay freeze, they realized that there was no way to go after it because we actually stand up and say, hey, we're agreeing with the contract. We don't like it, but we're going to comply with it. What they decided to do is come up with this ruse that somehow Prop B was the creature of the mayor and the city council. You see, the mayor and the city council, they love pension reform. And so what they did was they went out And they got a bunch of citizens to sign. Well, actually, we got 155,000 citizens. They're all in on it. 155,000 citizens that signed the pension initiative are all part of this grand conspiracy. Because the mayor and the council actually wanted to do this all along. And we got these 155,000 citizens to sign a petition to put this on the ballot just for show. Seriously?
Serious.
Seriously.
So serious.
And so you look at this, it's the best they got. I mean, what they're trying to do is say, hey, you didn't meet and confer with us on this. And our response is, it's a citizens' initiative. Under the California State Constitution, citizens have the right of initiative. It doesn't say, unless the labor union bosses disagree. No. It says if the citizens collect signatures, they place something on the ballot, if that passes, it becomes law. Now, you can argue that what the law is doing is not legal, but that's not what they're arguing. They're saying that the citizens were part of a grand conspiracy. Now, at first they were saying citizens don't have a right of initiative to monkey with our benefits. They knew that that was going to be kind of laughed out of court. So now they're coming up with this very complex argument that somehow this is the mayor's initiative or this is the city council's initiative. We'll go to state court. I believe fully that the Supreme Court will look at the state constitution, particularly the section that deals with charter cities, and we are a charter city. There's other language in the state constitution that protects this initiative that's not been made subject to their legal complaint, but that will be used in the Supreme Court if necessary. And then on top of that, there's a federal civil rights lawsuit under the First Amendment, which we don't have to file at this point, but we're prepared to do. So I believe ultimately, Prop B, we are very confident that there will be no changes in that, despite kind of the, oh, we're going to take this all the way to the Supreme Court. That's fine. That's for San Diego. Where do we go statewide? Michael Zucchett is correct. We need to do more reforms statewide. Other cities and counties have not gone in this direction. Why? Because their unions have blocked it. Their politicians are weak-kneed on both political parties. This is not a Democrat-Republican issue. It's a bipartisan. The murder weapon has bipartisan fingerprints all over it. And so we need to turn to the voters and get the voters to apply pension reform. That's why I'm working with Democratic Mayor Chuck Reed from San Jose, formerly Mayor of San Jose, to qualify an initiative and get this passed in the state of California. 2018 is our timetable for that. It's not going to be easy, but that's the next step, is you've got to reform these systems statewide or else we go bankrupt. All you have to do is type in pension tsunami, pension bankruptcy. This is not a California issue. It's happening nationwide. Unfortunately, time is on the side of the labor unions. The more we wait to reform, the more people are able to cash those very, very lucrative checks. But at some point, the dam will break, and there will be bankruptcy. And we've got to make those changes before that happens. That's kind of my view of what's going to be happening next.
Okay, I'd like to get to questions too, but we got to take care of a little business first. So, Carl, remember the 25%, 75% thing? So, I'll tell you what, I will let you run my union for a day if I'm wrong, and if you're wrong, I get to have your radio show for a week.
A week?
Yeah, I think that's fair. 15 hours. 8 hours? Yeah, okay, that's a good point. All right, maybe half a week. Gosh,
Well, when you take the commercials out, then it is about 8 hours.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Carl. You are fair. So, Social Security, not Medicare. Well, it's actually and Medicare, but Social Security in 1982 was what was promised by Mayor Pete Wilson to entice employees out of or to get them out of Social Security to get the retiree medical health. So just to correct that, $55,000 a year is the annual salary today in 2016, not in 1981. It's today. $55,000 a year is the average salary. Carl is right that the average pension payout includes people who retired at other times other than 2016. However, on the general side, the employee that retires today on the general side of the city workforce is still under $40,000 a year in terms of an annual pension payout that they paid for life. All those other eye-popping numbers he talked about, again, you got to give Carl credit. He is taking in all of their other stuff, including their own money, their own contributions to their drop accounts, which come in a lump sum frame, but it's their money. It would be like taking your money that you pay into your 401k, and when you retire, say, look at all this money he's getting. It's my money. I've been putting into it. And then he adds it into to the base pension numbers and comes up with those eye-popping numbers, even at the extremes. But just be sure, they are at the extremes. They're not the average. The city's compensation study, not the dirty labor union bosses, but the cities of San Diego's compensation study, completed in November, 6 months ago, showed that our represented employees make 25 to 30% less on a total compensation basis compared to other jurisdictions in San Diego County, not in California, but in the county of San Diego. It's great that Carl thinks that we should be compared to the private sector, but they don't have police officers and firefighters and 911 dispatchers and librarians in the private sector. That's not who we compete with. We compete with Chula Vista and Carlsbad and National City and the county of San Diego. And so, again, to deny that there's a competitive disadvantage in San Diego and to deny that it's not a result of Prop B is just means that I should be doing a radio show. So now let's finish up with this Prop B, because I'm really glad Mr. DeMaio doesn't like our legal argument. But here's his problem. The mayor of San Diego, the former mayor of San Diego, Jerry Sanders, really likes our legal argument because he testified under oath at a week-long administrative hearing in Glendale a few years ago in the initial stages of this litigation with the Public Employment Relations Board that he did exactly what we allege, which is he specifically intended to evade the law as it relates to public employee bargaining in the state of California. And by the way, let's talk about that law just for 1 second. It's called the Myers-Milius-Brown Act. Doesn't mean you have to do what the labor unions say. Doesn't mean the labor unions get veto power. All it means is you have to talk to them. You have to meet and confer with them in good faith and listen to what they have to say. You have to have an exchange of ideas. You have to not make up your mind until you talk with the people who are going to be most affected by what you're doing. And the city's history is littered with cases like managed competition, where the city, in good faith, said, we like managed competition. What do you think, unions? We said, we hate managed competition. Don't do it. They said, thank you for your opinion. We're going to do it anyway. That's the legal way to do it. But Mayor Sanders, for some reason, didn't want to do that in this case. He wanted to go around that process, and he wanted to pretend to be a private citizen. So he went to the city attorney, Jan Goldsmith, and he said, hey, I got an idea. I've got this pesky charter requirement that I'm supposed to be the one in charge of meeting and confer with the labor unions, but how about I just take that hat off one day, and the next day I'll just be Jerry, resident of Kensington, and I'm just going to be a private citizen who wants to do this. Will that work? And Jan Goldsmith says, yeah, that's a great idea. The problem is, the mayor then went on to use city resources, city employees, the power of his office, the state of the city address, the city attorney as his legal advisor, council members, city resources, city money, taxpayer money, to write, draft, amend, negotiate with Carl and others a pension reform initiative on behalf of the city. And so what the Public Employment Relations Board said, well, no, you can't have it both ways. You either were the mayor acting as the city or you were private citizen Jerry. And all of these other things means that you were Mayor Sanders, not private citizen Jerry. And also testifying under oath was the city's chief operating officer, Jay Goldstone, who said that he used city resources and the pension board's actuary to do all this stuff, and the city's and the mayor's chief of staff, and the mayor's deputy chief of staff, and the mayor's press secretary, and the mayor's deputy press secretary. There was a parade of witnesses, all under oath, who said, yeah, that's what we did all day, in a city building, on city time, on a city computer, with city resources, getting paid by the taxpayers. Well, were you volunteering? Well, no, I was only there because I was getting paid. Well, did the mayor tell you to do it? Yeah. Why else would I be doing it? I work for the mayor. I thought he was a private citizen. So the guts of Mr. DeMaio to use the term ruse to describe our lawsuit is hilarious, because that is what we call what the city did with Mayor Sanders leading the way. That's what the administrative law judge said he did. That's what the Public Employment Relations Board said he did. And as Mr. DeMaio says, now the 4th District Court of Appeal is going to weigh in. And I'm sure the losing party will appeal that to the California Supreme Court. But the record that was created under oath by these witnesses is undisputed. The question is, does it matter? And that's their other argument is, well, so what? Our First Amendment right to vote for this, that trumps all. You don't need to worry about those pesky labor laws. Yeah, don't worry about that. One law trumps the other. We'll see. But I don't think that's the way statutes work. I see the judge nodding. Yes, he agrees with me. No, no. Okay, maybe I didn't see that. But I know deep down that's what he's thinking. I can read judges well. And so, anyway, so that's where we are in terms of the future of pension reform in San Diego. As I've said, on the merits, it's bad for San Diego. It's bad for the operations of San Diego. It's bad for the public safety of San Diego. It's bad for the competitive standing of San Diego to hire qualified employees. But setting all that aside, it's illegal. No matter how many times Mr. DeMaio or Mayor Sanders says it's legal, it was done illegally. So has said the administrative law judge and the administrative board who's looked at it so far. We'll see what the 4th District Court of Appeals said. And when that bill comes due, if the 4th District Court of Appeal agrees that the city screwed the pooch on this, what do they have to do? They're going to have to go back and undo it all with interest and pay the attorneys, and this entire political folly that could have been avoided and already was in the process of being avoided by meeting and conferring in good faith with the employees who were partners in this before the political shenanigans began, would have been a much less expensive path, and not to mention a lot better for the city of San Diego.
Very good. Thank you, gentlemen. We have about 5 minutes for questions. I would ask that you please keep your questions brief so we can get to a few of you, and please no speeches from the audience. Sir.
Hi, I've got a question related to this, and particularly the future. And I wonder what, and the question is this: why was Prop B even necessary, and why would this initiative in 2018 be necessary if the Constitution says that every government agency has to have a balanced budget? Because if you have expenditures...
Yeah, I get the question. All right. So if that interpretation were correct, then we could never have any bonded debt. And there have been some permutations on that argument that have been made and have not been successful in overturning vested pension contracts. Orange County had floated that as part of one of their lawsuits on pension reform. Why was it needed in 2012? Because...
No, I know what, you answered the question.
But let me answer.
Okay.
It was needed in 2012 because the mayor and the city council did not want to reform pensions the way the taxpayers wanted it reformed. And Michael is absolutely misrepresenting reality. The mayor talks about pension reform. The mayor even was working with me and confirmed on pension reform. And in fact, pensionable pay was presented to the labor unions on a unanimous vote of the San Diego City Council, and the unions turned that down. So there was a separate track talking about pension reform among city officials. That is not in dispute. And that was not disputed in Glendale on those depositions. But the facts are very clear that the Proposition B was developed outside of the city of San Diego, refined outside the city of San Diego, not using government attorneys, but using private sector attorneys, private sector actuaries. It was filed by 3 proponents not in the city of San Diego. It may have been supported and endorsed by a variety of coalition members, including myself and the mayor and others. However, it is a citizens' initiative. If Michael Zucchett's reading of the facts were correct, then the U.S. Attorney, the District Attorney, the Attorney General of the state of California should be bringing charges against Mayor Sanders, even today, because it would be an admission of misuse of public funds. He knows that that's not happening because his statement of facts is incorrect. You cannot, under the law, use government resources for the creation and promotion of a ballot measure. Plain and simple, it is illegal. Now, you can propose a ballot measure and vote to put it on the ballot, but you must step back at that point and not advocate for or against it. Using government money, you cannot do that. Individual city resources, individual city representatives may take positions on ballot measures. For example, your very own Todd Gloria right now is out there promoting a minimum wage increase. He's doing that in a private capacity. If he instructs his staff to go out and hold rally signs on paid time, well then that is a felony. And that's why Mr. Zucchett's arguments are laughable in that if he's correct, then a couple folks should be brought up on criminal charges and sent to jail. But that never happened, and
So-
he knows it didn't happen.
So just very briefly, don't believe me. I agree with Carl on that. Don't believe me. Go to our website, www.sdmea.org. Click on the latest issue of the Viewpoint magazine, and you'll see Jerry Sanders' own words under oath as to what happened, how resources were used. And so I'm not sure if Mr. DeMaio's even seen those transcripts, but those were under oath. We don't allege that it was a ruse and a misuse of public funds. We allege that it was a city initiative and that he was okay to be using city resources because it was a city initiative. We're not arguing that criminal charges should be filed. We're arguing that what happened, happened, and it makes it a city initiative. Gosh darn it, I had another point, but I just lost it. I'll have to let it go.
If you're arguing that it was a city initiative,
Yes.
and yet there were
155,000.
155,000 citizens that signed this, how can you argue there was a city initiative and there was no criminal activity?
So I'm so glad you brought that up because you reminded me of the second thought, which is that the reason it's a city initiative is because the mayor holds a special distinction in the city charter. If Carl DeMaio had done this all on his own, the legalities of this would be different, I would agree. But it wasn't Carl DeMaio, it was Mayor Sanders. And Mayor Sanders under our city charter is the person who is responsible for enforcing meet and confer, for initiating negotiations with the labor unions. It would be like President Obama being commander-in-chief under our Constitution, but saying one day, you know, I don't think I want to be commander-in-chief today. I'm going to be private citizen Barack today, and I'm going to talk to the military, but not as commander-in-chief, but as private citizen. When that title, when that power is conferred on you as the person responsible for the entity, the city of San Diego, for following the law, and you do these things, it makes the city responsible for what the mayor did. What happened after that, and how it got to the ballot, and how many people signed it, under the law, isn't relevant. What's relevant is how did it get there? Who created it? Who drafted it? Who paid for it? Who negotiated it? This isn't a matter of Todd Gloria supporting a ballot initiative. This is a matter of the mayor, the only person under our charter responsible for enforcement of the law on meet and confer, specifically admitting under oath, in quotes, here, let's just do some quotes here. My gosh, my vision
I stipulated
is
that.
going.
So-
Okay,
so
you stipulate,
the-
great. Well, Carl still thinks it's a lie, but he needs to go to our website.
But still,
I've read the
there are
transcripts.
signatures, and some money went in to collect those signatures.
About $2
So-
million went into collecting the
And
signatures.
so there was a ballot initiative process that was
Yeah.
followed. Perhaps the mayor did something he shouldn't have done,
Right.
but this process did proceed.
Yeah.
Isn't that process still valid?
Well, that's essentially the argument of the proponents, which is it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that, I'm not saying you are stipulating that the mayor
I'm just asking.
broke the law, but let's say it doesn't matter if he did, it doesn't matter. The citizens spoke, we're done. And I agree, that's what they're arguing. Do I think that's the state of the law? No,
What's your
I
argument
don't.
against that?
What's the argument against that is that if that's your argument, then why have any other law on the books? If somebody's constitutional or free speech right or right of petition is going to trump all that stuff, why have labor law at all? Or all kinds of other laws, if anything's just going to trump it, if you can just sort of go, and especially if you admit that you're specifically trying to get around that law, perverting the initiative process, the citizens' initiative process to get around it, what's the point? So I think it has much broader implications for, forgive me, for like our whole society and the rule of law. If some laws matter and some laws don't, that's not a good.
I'll tell you what the implications are, because I know we have a lot of lawyers in the room. Think about this. What are the implications of this case law being established? Suppose the rules were reversed and Mayor Bob Filner were mayor, and I'm on the outside, and I decide I want to reform pensions. Bob Filner's giving away the store. So I file a ballot measure, I raise money, we get 55,000 signatures, we qualify it, and Bob Filner says, with his little labor union backers, hey, this thing's a freight train. They're going to reform these pensions. The gig is up. They're unplugging us. But I got an ace card. I'm going to come out publicly and I'm going to support it. Why would you do that, Bob? Well, did you see the case law established down in San Diego? All I have to do is say I'm for it, and then bam, it's unfair labor bargaining. And as a result, we can kill this just with me saying, I'm for it. That is a ruse. And that's the implication of that case law. And the judges are going to have to understand that if you follow this logic, that just because Jerry Sanders says, I support something, I'm endorsing something, does not make it a city initiative. Politicians endorse ballot measures all the time. They are prohibited, however, from using official resources as part of a campaign to pass those ballot measures. That is the law. It has been established. If they want to make new law, that gets us into some pretty dangerous territory. And the record is very clear. This was not a ballot measure developed by the mayor's office. It was not developed inside city council or city chambers. This was done on the outside. The only person they didn't depose in this lawsuit, do you want to know the only person they didn't call for deposition? Right here. Oh, she just said it, because you're not the lead negotiator for the city. We have to see if we can create this perception that Mayor Sanders created a ballot measure out of whole cloth using city resources, which is not supported by the record. Now, they are referring to another proposal that the mayor did make as it relates to what he would like to see the labor unions agree to in meet and confer. He made this proposal in November. That proposal was discussed at the city council in January. In January to February, we sat down with our labor unions and negotiated, and they said no. The record is clear. And so this is going to all come out in the wash. I mean, having truth on your side is a very liberating position to take. And let me just leave you with this one last thing. Let's suppose for a moment that somehow you get what you want, Mike. Careful of what you wish for, because the impacts to the city budget of what the demand would be is that we'd have to give pensions to all these employees. We'd have to undo all sorts of elements of Prop B, along with 7 3/4% interest, compound. How many layoffs are we going to have to make at that point, and who's responsible? And then finally, you thought Prop B was bad? Wait till you read the son of Prop B, because the voters will be wicked in outrage about what you did to overturn their vote in 2012, create financial distress from 2012 to present day. And they'll turn around and say, okay, we really mean pension reform, and here's our new reform package. So where is the end game, Mike? What is the good thing for your employees? Is it to continue to litigate the problems of the past, or is it to accept that this is a framework that we can now use to try to provide good benefits and salaries to government employees? I urge you to take that latter position, because Prop B allows us to do that.
Well, ladies and gentlemen,
Oh my gosh, we're going to end on that.
we're going to hold on that. But I want to thank you all for attending. I want to thank our speakers, Mr. Carl DeMaio, Mr. Mike Zucchet, and please give them a warm thank you. And this debate is to be continued. Mr. Darby, you have anything to add?
I'd just like to, again, thank our speakers and thank everyone for coming, and especially I'd like to thank Hannah and Heather for making sure we're well stocked with food right here. As you can see, we've got plenty to go, and I want to make sure no one goes back to the office hungry, so please help yourselves. Thanks again, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, so very good. That's good. Very good. You should come to North.